too. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Let's do this. Manage co-hosts. And then let's see. Yeah, manage. Save changes.
That was my video mirror.
Okay. You send a message into the group?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. And we are streaming presently on YouTube. Is it more we'd like to share
We
that?
We are? Okay, cool. How many have announced to be online? Oh, we see a couple of folks already online.
Yeah, welcome, class.
So you can also have your video on
So what?
you can have your video on for now while you're standing there.
Oh,
Yeah. And then the next thing was like, now we got two angles.
that's all.
And can we turn on the spotlights? We're gonna do that. Yeah. You know, and then I was like, okay, I'm just gonna go in here, whatever. And I just super confusing. I was like, set up. Yeah. Ooh, this is good.
Wow, guys, this is, huh? Yeah. Huh?
Look at the stage.
It's just rampenlicht.
This is the stage. I know. All the lights. There's the lights.
Let's take a picture before we start.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh, I can
Let's put first the slides on so folks would see it. Hi. So it's software works, right? Oh, wait a second. We are going to. I wanted to actually to do the.
And then we can.
Why is it small now? Oh, because it's sharing just.
It's sharing the tab only.
Do you need to share the screen to your Zoom? I thought you could share the window to Zoom.
It is sharing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it says share. Me is sharing.
Okay,
Yeah, you can click slideshow. And then here, try making it full screen. I have a shortcut as well. We can do Command Shift F. Oh, that's not. Usually that works. Interesting. Command Shift B.
This is as good as it goes.
Yeah, I mean, Command Shift F typically removes the top bar. But
Just real quick. Stop sharing. Let's go back again.
or
Maybe if I
yeah.
share the
Oh,
entire
actually, if you just
screen,
share
right?
the screen itself.
Not this one. And then the question is.
You just select this, yeah. Perfect.
And then
I think
go
now
here.
it should work. Perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
Does that work?
Fantastic. Yeah.
Looks great.
Well,
And
let's
let's
see.
test the clicker. Oh, remember that's a button. Yeah.
All right, go back.
Okay.
Perfect.
And
Now
then
you-
go.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
So
So then just use this
you're
one.
on stage.
Yeah, sure. Let's take a photo. Yes.
Oh, this is amazing. Perfect.
That's the one.
Okay.
The president.
Oh yeah. Of course.
Hands, right?
Okay. Perfect. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Nice.
Okay.
Okay, that's amazing.
Okay, thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.
Oh my god. I can also do a picture of the teaching team.
Yeah, we should.
Absolutely. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Am I supposed to use it or not?
Yes.
Let's see if we can.
Awesome. Creative event. That's a great picture.
Yeah. 3, 2, 1. Let's do one like this too. 3, 2, 1.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. And then I'll be sharing those in the group.
So let's wait another 4 minutes. We kick
Yeah, of
off 4 minutes sharp, and then we have maybe somebody can just.
So you use this one or the-
Both of them work. Depends on
Okay.
the personal preference.
And actually, Tomas, let's turn off your video.
Let's turn off what?
Oh, I can do it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can just say it.
I think
Oh, you're trying now? One, two, three. Is that okay? 1, 2, 3. Yes. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, does that work better?
Yeah, because I'm now holding this thing.
Oh, no. Okay.
Yeah, so it's better. I'm using this as a clicker.
Okay, awesome. If you want to
Sure.
I'll check if there's anyone outside.
our head of education originally was holding
Yeah, it's 40. Yeah, and then there's gonna be additional like support, there's additional under SC. So, yeah, should be really good. It's really informative.
Yeah, we should get the recording too.
Okay, sure. Oh, Tomaso, I think you need to share again on share the slides again on there.
It's not working.
It's not sharing. It's not sharing. So just do that one.
I didn't click anything.
Oh yeah, okay, we're good. This means we're live.
Are you seeing it now?
Yeah. This one's the other.
Does it look good?
And then you can just put the height on.
The
Yeah.
lost? Did I lose the connection? You do it manually? Oh, what a bummer.
Okay. Good evening. How's everybody doing? Fantastic. Another Thursday evening entrepreneurship in decentralized application. Who's excited here? Raise your hands. Wow. And who's excited here? Make some noise. Fantastic. Greetings to also the entire folks online. Today we have a special guest. In October last year, was a guy who presented a big repositioning of a company that most of us use. It was started roughly 15 years ago, and at the end, this guy called Mark, he says, and because we are repositioning and envisioning the future, we are also changing the name to Meta. And this happened a couple of months ago. Okay? And tonight, we have the pleasure to introduce, and we have the pleasure to learn from a person who actually started this topic 10 years ago. Yatsu, who is the chairman of the Animoca brands with over 150 investments in application. Who knows about the Animoca brands? Raise your hands. Let's see here. Oh, okay. All right. I'm in good position, man. That's good. Who knows Allen words? Allen words? Again, okay. Dapper? Okay. Who knows some crypto wallets like MetaMask? Okay. These and many, many more are investments that Yat did. And today we have the pleasure to hear what makes an NFT strategy, what makes a metaverse, how do you come up with it, right? And hopefully you as entrepreneurs, right, can, please actually, the best thing I think that we can get out of Yat's moment here is start creating some questions that we take at the end. Okay, we'll take in 3, 4, 5 questions. Okay, while you see that Yat is presenting. And without further ado, thank you so much. A big round of applause. Thank you.
So it's a great pleasure to be here, talking to the future generation of crypto leaders, hopefully. Right? Anyway, quickly, I think Thomas already gave a nice introduction on Animoca brands. So we have actually over 150 investments today. Many of the companies that you will have heard of or if you're in the space we use. OpenSea, Sky Davis, which is Axie Infinity, Bitsky, Dapper Labs, Wax, Decentraland. We own the Sandbox. We also own Red and Tower, Limpo, and a whole bunch of actually 12 companies in the group that is expanding in this area. And I'll explain later why we have this strategy. It's quite unusual in the sense that half of our business is really investing in the open ecosystem, the open metaverse as we call it, but we're not a VC, so we are not running a venture. Means that we don't have to return capital to our LPs, which is intentional in that sense, because we don't have LPs. We're a corporation, although actually a public corporation. And then, of course, building our own businesses that are all sharing the network effect with the portfolio as well. Meaning that whatever is built, what we build, is also shared with everything in the open space. And we think that's important. I'll explain shortly after why that's important. Now, talking about the metaverse, as Tommaso quickly introduced. First of all, Well, I didn't come up with the term, obviously, that came up much earlier. You know, Facebook has brought attention to the term of the metaverse, and many people think of this as the next logical iteration of the internet, which we agree with probably. But what they're building is a different kind of metaverse, which we'll describe later, a closed one. And there's a reason why they're doing this way. But I would argue that the beginning of the metaverse, the journey of it, really began 40 years ago. And actually, these were, all of you are way too young to perhaps know what these things are. But these were the devices that I used. So I'm much older than all of you, I think. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, actually in Vienna, in Austria. And the first devices that I connected online to was a text instrument and a Commodore 64, eventually an Atari ST, this is the VCS. Maybe your parents know this, or maybe your grandparents. Right? And this green thing is a phone, which I don't know how many of you here know what a phone looks like. There you go, right? There you go. So this is a generational thing, but it's a reason why we still have a phone handle on our WhatsApp, right? If you have wondered why that device is there, it's because phones used to look this way. And we used to connect online with this thing called an acoustic coupler that we would put on top. And if you used to, or if your parents maybe had a fax machine that would screech the same way, we would connect, and the speed we would get would be about 2.4K, which is, you know, back then a lot of data. And today, basically, it can even power, you know, basically a basic small device. Anyway, that's how we connected online. And we already, back in the days, that was the way that we interfaced online, which was all text-based, right? That was the acoustic coupler. And CompuServe was basically the pre-internet type service in which I went online. And for me, this was very natural because I grew up basically very much as, you know, one of the very few Chinese people in Vienna. If anyone knows anything about Vienna, certainly in the 70s and 80s, there were very few of us there. There's not that many of us there, but there's a lot less back then. But I found sort of a way to connect to the world back then. There was only hundreds of thousands of people using it back then. But it was a place that I felt comfortable. I didn't know this was the internet or the metaverse, but at the time it didn't matter where I was from, you know, even languages I spoke, it just mattered that I was connecting with other people around the world who shared a common interest. Or in my case, I started coding and sharing code. And that's actually how I got a job at Atari. But, you know, we'll talk about that later maybe. But more importantly, the journey where we are today to the definition of the metaverse, I would say, started really almost 40 years ago. We slowly started to get trained towards this moment where we became much more digital dependent than we were in the beginning. And I just wanted to share this ad here. This was CompuServe in the 80s, where they talked about basically how the computer would turn you into a travel agent, take you to space, you know, all these things that today we associate with the internet. But that was 4 decades ago. Anyway, let's talk about actually what happened since. From the small, humble beginnings of the internet, or the pre-internet, we've now gone to a point where there's over 4.6 billion people online, 3.2 billion people actually play games on a regular basis, and what do we do every single day? Very likely, certainly everyone in this room probably is spending a lot of time online. What's the first thing you do in the morning? Probably on your device. Maybe even when you're having breakfast, lunch, or dinner, even when you're with your friends, the likelihood that you may be physically present, but where is your mind? Your mind is very likely online. Which means that we are already digital dependent in some form or fashion. We probably also value our digital attention a lot more in terms of what people think of us on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram than necessarily what people think in terms of physical, our physical world. But let's talk about what is the true metaverse and why this is so important. Now that we perhaps established that we are really dependent on our digital existence. So we don't think this is the metaverse, which is perhaps what Facebook would like us to think, which is AR and VR. And maybe we can talk about this later, but this is not how we think of the metaverse. The true metaverse from our perspective and what we're all about about this valuable resource. And actually, it began with industrialization. Is that in the past, the work that we would perform, the labor that we perform was ours, literally the fruits of our labor. If I had a plot of land and I would basically labor towards it to receive, an apple or fruits, they were my fruits. I would use it to control it. And the tools to do were mine, starting with my hands and then equipment. But as we move to the age of machines, of which really technology and the computer is really just a sort of supercharged version of it, who owns those machines are not actually the ones who are laboring on it. They're actually owned by the platforms in this case, Facebooks, the Amazons, the Googles of the world. And what we have here is a situation where each and every one of us in the world are these little blocks of resources. We are data. We mine and give our data to Facebook or to Amazon or to Tencent or to every centralized platform we see in the world today.
Here, duck. Okay. Now should work.
Or no, turn it off here. Sorry. Mute it here, please.
is that, and I think maybe some previous speakers may have spoken about this, and actually why blockchain and crypto is interesting, but before we even go there, is that there's a rising wealth inequality in the world. And this really started with industrialization, because the ones who own the machines that actually create the value is not owned by the people who labor on them today. Meaning that we've gone from a world where most of us we are actually all renters. 99.9% of us are actual digital renters. Which means that if this continues the way that it is, there's going to continue to be rising wealth inequality as a whole, and is one of the big problems that we have today, and will continue to exacerbate. If you just take a look here, for instance, even from my own experience, 20 or 30 years ago, if you would have considered people in the tech world, people who worked for Google or Facebook, to actually be considered almost the enemy, that would have been seen ridiculous at the time, because tech people and geeks were supposed to be the ones that were going to save the world, they were going to do good things. And now they've lived in their own little sort of gilded cages of value, just because of the fact that they live a privileged life because they have access to this. They're the ones there. But most of the classic forms of labor are not as valuable anymore, for many reasons we just discussed. So, why is non-fungible tokens so important? And why is it the main reason that we ended up focusing so heavily on this, really over 4.5, maybe even 5 years ago? So the very first thing to understand about NFTs and why we're so excited is that they are open digital assets. They represent property rights in the same way that owning a house or car is a piece of property. But the difference is that when you think of data as property residing in something like Facebook, that is actually Facebook's property because it's within the control of their closed data. You can't access it unless just with permission from Facebook. But with data that sits on blockchain, which could be both fungible and non-fungible in this case, which would be an asset like a virtual real estate or a house or something, it's now a public good, which means that not only is it maintained forever on the blockchain, other people can compose on it and create their own experiences. And this is what we see in real life every single day. The fact that someone owns a car or a house allows them to compose an experience on top of the work of others because of private decentralized ownership. With NFTs, it's the same. You can basically layer experiences and experiences on top of it through applications or other forms that then make the actual NFT itself richer through the contribution of others. Let me illustrate that in a physical context. Private ownership of cars is actually a platform. Despite the fact that we actually, and I think I shared this article earlier, so maybe you've read this, but it's worth reiterating, that ownership of cars has become a platform greater than the selling of cars itself. The sale of the car is a small part of the business of what is actually the car industry itself. If you think about things like Uber, Didi, Grab, Lyft, car wash companies, tire companies, car accessorization companies, each of these actually represent industries far, far greater than the sale of the car itself. Not by 10 or 20%, but literally by 30 or 50 times. The amount of jobs that exist because the car exists is far greater. And that's basically the power here in terms of ownership. The fact that I can own a house is the reason why a bank can give me a 30 or 40-year mortgage, for instance. If I don't own a house, if I can only rent it, I can get long-term value for it. You can't compose on top of the work in which you don't have an ownership. So this is a key critical understanding that doesn't exist in the digital world. What that allows you to do now in the digital context, just like what we have in the physical one, is that we can now compose in the same way as we had in the physical world, basically in the digital world. If I have a virtual store in one game, I'm adding an added network effect by actually creating the support for it in maybe 5 or 6 games. Or the fact that there could be a lending protocol, the fact that I could have a mortgage on it. These are actually all network effects that enhance the value of the property. When you think of your physical car or your physical shoes that you wear or anything like this, they have a network effect themselves. The added utility, the social connection, its social value are in fact all different added network effects that you add into the ownership of others. And so this is the part that digital assets couldn't do before, because every added network effect, first of all, only belonged to the platform, say like a game studio or Facebook. At the same time, it was entirely permissioned. They could take it away. You can access it maybe through permission with APIs that they can remove. Who controls those APIs? It's as if you were sort of renting a piece of property and the landlord could just remove it at any time. Or you thought you bought a house that you owned, and 6 months later they just take it away. And we certainly have experienced what it means for certain countries, for instance, where they can do that. Property rights are poor, economic potential is low. I'll discuss that a little bit later, but property rights is foundational to allow for peer-to-peer ownership economics to take place as we have in the physical world. NFTs also become these powerful social identifiers because everything that we own is in fact a social identifier. When you make a decision to buy a car, actually how much of that value is based on how quickly it can transport you from point A to point B. In fact, the majority of the reasons why you purchase a car or buy certain clothes or have certain value in what you perceive is a social identifier. Cars are by definition probably one of the worst classic investments you can think of. Right? It's not going to give you any money whatsoever. But why do you choose to buy a Tesla or maybe a BMW or a Rolls Royce or a Bentley perhaps? You're making a statement about who you are. And in fact, when you look at it for luxury goods, like when you look at it for even a choice of where you live, people often ask about virtual real estate. That seems kind of interesting. Why would someone buy virtual real estate? Well, what's the difference between living in an expensive neighborhood and in a less expensive neighborhood? When you could perhaps live in a bigger house, you have a bigger garden, you have a bigger lifestyle, and yet you prefer to be in perhaps more crowded spaces. Not because it gives you a better quality of life, because it is in fact a social identifier. Now, we already identify very socially online because we are digital dependents. How many likes we have on Instagram, what people think of ourselves and their skills in our games, actually is equally valuable. That value is now possible to be ascribed as ownership, and ownership is actually the paradigm which you can build on top of. So this is an example I give often, I describe it a little bit, but actually Bored Apes have already flipped in terms of the value of, I guess, floor price Birkin bags. But you know, when you think about when someone buys a Birkin bag, which is worth, I don't know, $130,000 or $150,000, how much of that value is in fact physical in nature? Are you buying it because of how it feels, or of the materials it's made of? And actually, very likely, 99.9% of the value that you buy in a Birkin bag, or perhaps even in your regular casual wear that you wear on shoes or watches, is entirely virtual. And what you're buying is a network effect. The network effect of social status, the network effect of what other people say about it, the network effect of potentially the utility in which it has something. Yes. And so if you accept that everything you purchase today is already mostly virtual in value, then the leap from going from 99% value, virtual value, to 100% virtual value like a Bored Ape doesn't seem that crazy anymore, because you're not actually buying it because of its utility. Just how we're not choosing to buy a Nike or an Adidas or a Reebok shoe because any one of these shoes make us run any faster. Not at all. They actually give us utility in other ways as social identifiers. So one of the other reasons why we think this is revolutionary as well, and why we invested so heavily in this space, is that we're really looking back at history and saying, well, what happens when you take any economy that was feudal and move it into a capitalist one? And this is essentially taking something that was permission, which is rental, to ownership. And just in the same way that you're not expecting that you're going to buy a house for 2 times of your monthly rent, you accept that, well, if I buy it, I have the long-term capital benefits, it's a freehold, I can pass it on to my family, it could have hundreds of years of value as long as the government is stable. Right? Then actually you accept that it's a 20 or 30 year or 40 year long-term value, which means that immediately what you capitalize on what used to be entirely rental is now ownership based, which explains also why something that might cost $10 is something worth thousands of dollars in the digital world because of the ownership economics that comes into play. Now, this is very difficult for people to comprehend sometimes if they've entirely lived in a rental context, right? For someone even for someone who's rented all their life, for instance, in a house. So I spent a lot of time in Europe earlier. Actually, I spent a lot of time in Berlin, Germany. Particularly Berlin had one of the lowest home ownership rates because you could literally rent forever. And one of the interesting constructs about actually European policy was that you could transfer your rent to your next generation. So the low rental fees basically provided a different platform elsewhere, which meant that many people, particularly in early Berlin, so post-war, actually didn't appreciate ownership because there was no value for them for that because rental wasn't generally fixed. So of course, naturally, why would you commit so much capital up front? But once that started to become more capitalist and opened up, the prices would increase because there was demand and supply, and the benefits of owning something started to become apparent. But for those who did not understand it, they basically missed out on this. They didn't get it. And this is where we are in the digital context as well. we don't fully appreciate and understand digital value because we are not yet out of the mindset that actually we exist in a rental economy and we're moving into one of ownership because blockchain now gives us permanent property rights in the assets that we could have digitally. And this applies to everything, virtual real estate, music, and so on. And I think one other thing that is worth talking about here is that the capital appreciation of this benefit means that as a creator, for instance, in this environment, you're now able to sell forward value. That's what's so powerful as an artist. It's as if you were a young Picasso and you don't actually make money just for the moment that you make, like say, like a teacher that sells at this moment, or a tutor that sells a service that is valuable literally only for the 1 hour that is maybe being delivered. But instead, you can actually capitalize this value to say, whatever I give you, you can have the long-term benefits of it, and therefore you get the long-term appreciation of it, as we do generally with things like intellectual property or other forms of capital. So the derivative of this type of digital property rights allows for interesting constructions. Like for instance, people who use them for rental services and games, loan collateralization, yield products, staking products, that are not related necessarily to pure utility. And I want to talk about this a little bit. So this isn't really talking about Axie Infinity, but it's related to this, of course, which is, you have games where you can make thousands of dollars a week, but also in Axie Infinity, a game where you would make maybe 100, 200 at its peak, maybe $500 to $1,000 a month in places like the Philippines, which of course was very economically liberating in those places. But the important thing to understand about why Axie Infinity became big was not because, Sky Mavis built a team, launched the product in the Philippines and created a marketing campaign as a traditional gaming company would to enter a market. They did none of that. In fact, most of them never even visited the Philippines. They didn't care about that market. It was actually the fact that private owners of Axies, just like private owners of cars, decided to build a business model that they thought would be beneficial to their audience and created a business model entirely decentralized. In the same way that someone decided to build, Travis decided to build Uber, or someone else built Grab or Lyft, entirely just because people own these cars or own these assets. So the decentralized ownership of Axies allowed for the construction of a new business that became the yield guild gaming kind of business. But they didn't need to ask for permission from Sky Mavis to say, am I allowed to use these Axies to launch it in this market? And in fact, if you think about all the innovation that we see, it is always built on top of the ownership of others. One of the favorite examples I like to put in the physical world is, baby seats in cars. The baby seat happened 30 or 40 years after the creation of the car. And I could just imagine if, the person who thought of, hey, we should be transporting our little babies and toddlers safely through car with these sort of, horseless carriages. And that proposal would probably have been laughed off basically by the car companies because they haven't designed it that way. We see this often in a permission environment where creativity is stifled because you have to ask permission for every step of the way. Right? Most of the best ideas don't come because others all agree. Most of the best ideas come because someone comes up with something crazy and then finds a market for it. And this is possible because of property rights and therefore all the economics that ensue from it. So I'll close with this quickly, and then we can maybe open some Q&A. So to two main thoughts. One of them is that we think the digital world and the physical world are actually very similar. The metaverse is a natural extension to our physical world, right? And we exist in it in the same way, just more efficiently. And we need to have property rights. And there's no foundation for property rights in the Web2 world because data is owned by someone else. But in blockchain, we have property rights because the data is a public good. And similarly to countries in the world, every country that has strong, secure property rights has a flourishing economy and actually has, a strong GDP, and most importantly, generally also a very good democracy, because property rights and democracy go hand in hand. Vis-a-vis those countries that have very low property rights, have generally low to non-functioning, maybe no democracies at all, right? Because they don't have the capitalist benefits as well, meaning that the GDPs in those places are also significantly lower than those in the ones that have. Our point is that the digital space is 99% basically like the GDPs of the bottom 20%. And that's also the reason why users are generally valued in the dollars or the cents. That's also the reason why a game needs to have 10 million users to be profitable, right? In the same way that these countries need to have maybe 10 million population in order to actually be sustainable. But when you move that GDP over, suddenly you can start actually translate the value from ownership, then you don't need to have millions of customers in the same way that a country doesn't need to have 100 million people to survive. That means you can have sustainable businesses and economies with thousands or tens of thousands, which is why when you have these NFT projects, it makes it unbelievable that you can build sustainable economies, on the basis of maybe just 10,000 customers online. But in the physical world, if you have 10,000 customers in your restaurant or 10,000 customers in any shop you have, that's a lot of customers. You can make a lot of money. It's a great living. So why does this paradigm not translate? Because we lack property rights until today. So I think this is maybe worth just a quick mention that this economist, Fernando de Soto, he defined this whole thing about realizing property rights in developing countries is going to basically unlock the debt capital that exists in these places. So, I think this is the same concept here. Actually, economic substance and all the capital that exists in those places that don't have property rights, like the digital world also, is debt. But we already have economic substance in them. Every time we make a decision online, every time we spend and do something online, actually we're making an economic substance decision. But there's no value because it's dead. And basically property rights will unlock that. So let me close with this, if you've seen it, I'm not sure. I think this is an important one because it sets the parallel for why we're so excited about this future. And also, frankly, what makes us human. So this is a test that was actually the body of work that was used by the late Sir Ken Robinson. George Land and Beth Johnson basically created a test for NASA scientists originally that was to try to define how divergent a thinker you are. Because if you're an engineer and you shoot someone to the moon for the first time and there's a problem, well, you need someone who's very creative to solve it because it's never been done before. You can't find a handbook in page 50 how to solve a moon landing problem, right? But he designed the same test and did this, what he used to use for NASA, and gave it to children. And he followed children from the age of 5 until 15 and gave the same test to adults. So this ended up being a multi-decade long study. And what he discovered is that actually children at the age of 5 solve problems 98% in a divergent manner. Meaning that most children were extremely creative at 5 years old. By the time they ended up being 10 years of age or so, it dropped to 30%. And by the time they were closer to your age, 12%. And the adults fared even worse. It was 2%. Now, there are some parallels that you can look since we talk about entrepreneurship. 2% is roughly also the entrepreneurial index that we see. Change makers in the world tend to be in the low single-digit percentages. They are also divergent in their approaches. They're also creative in their thinking. They're also people who think outside of the box in the classic sense. What it also means in this study is that actually humans are generally creative from birth. We're not made to be creative, we are born creative. And something in the system, because of schooling, because of the history of Victorian colleges, and the industrialization age, that creativity societally is being stamped out of us because they needed people to not be creative. In fact, 100 years ago, if everyone was free-thinking people, it might be causing too many revolutions. It would be too many problems. Nobody would actually be making, late laborious work. They'd all just be thinking of ideas, which back then, 100 years ago, didn't work. So it's suited for humanity to be more like a machine. But today, we have machines that do that work a lot better. And in fact, the value today comes from being entirely creative, which is actually more natural to us as humans. And so this is the construct as I see it, and blockchain is the next way in which we liberate this. I grew up in a time where the calculator was banned in classrooms because it was considered a device for cheating. Right? Now imagine what your school life would be like if you couldn't use a computer even, never mind a calculator. But the reason why this was so powerful as an early form of computing device is it allowed for someone who was not actually strong at math to become an architect or to do things creatively on architecture that he didn't need to be the best mathematician anymore to do it. He or she could do it just fine, except they now had a device that would take this type of work away so they could do what they were actually best at, which is dream up stuff. And that's basically the power of what technology has offered. And just like 40 years ago, we sort of dreamt up these ideas and people were thinking that, we could do all these imaginative things, actually. This is something that we think is now truly possible because we're no longer limited through physical constraints and physical resources as we do today. And in closing, I will say, this is around basically, where are we going to survive in the future? You don't need to be a driver. Classic labor, all the kind of work that's out there is not actually valuable. So what are the things that we can do that machines cannot? And that is about feeling, empathy, and creativity, what innately makes us human. And the metaverse, as we see it, and digital property rights, is one of the key answers towards it, and why we're so bullish and why we're investing so heavily. Because the paradigm of the time that you spend is entirely creative and effort. And similarly to our time, creative time that we spend, none of it has to be the same. We don't have to be, your time and my time don't have to be valued exactly the same. We think the future isn't going to be run by something like a universal basic income, which is one way to solve this. We think the future is going to be run by universal basic equity. And the reason we can call it that is because our data and our time becomes equity, because we own it on the blockchain. We own it as a data set. It is our data, therefore it is our equity. What we make of it is up to us. So we think that's how the future will roll out. And we think we're very optimistic that this is what things will end up. So thank you so much for your time.
Right, fantastic. Thank you so much. Last questions. We have 5. Yeah. Maybe let's see without running here from mic to mic. Maybe you want to set up just real quick and ask the questions without a mic just to test it, and let's see if we need the mics.
Okay.
Can you hear okay?
I can hear.
Okay, so I don't need to run the mics.
So my question is, do you see the expansion of Web 3.0, such as expansion and growth of Web 2.0, like in terms of growth and market adoption, and at the same time, in terms of quest and conquest for data? And so do you see like Web 3.0 could become one day, because now it's decentralized and seen as an alternative to the derives of Web 2.0, becoming the former 2.0 and becoming public enemies, as you were mentioning before?
Okay. So the question, as I understand, is is Web3 going to replace Web2 in effect?
My question is, like, do you see the Web 2.0 becoming the former 2.0 and taking the bad effects, like in terms of quest and conquest for data, for instance, having the same market adoption, and stuff like that?
So first, I think Web2 is, we think, first of all, Web2 is going to be entirely replaced by Web3, because ultimately, as a framework, it is much better for the end user to be in Web3 than Web2. There is absolutely no parallel. Right? If you choose between forever renting versus actually owning, it's very clear, right? We see it as in the physical world, we see it the same way in the digital world, the same. But the one thing I think we want to move away from is to try to make a direct comparison between the technological adoption, because we think of this as much more of a societal adoption, in the same way that the first wave of the internet, when it democratized information and knowledge, that actually created big societal changes as well. This basically democratizes the ownership of your digital assets, and is one where actually these assets are really, if you think about it, an open space. Meaning that I think of this as like the age of exploration. It's like literally going to a new country that nobody has yet fully explored, and you can mark up and take your territory, take your land, like being an explorer. Instead of exploring to space though, you actually can explore literally from your bedroom on a computer as you're building out and mapping that. Because it is your personal time, it is your data, it is your social time that actually is being mined, and it could be a part of you. So will there be friction? Absolutely, because for all the companies that are running in Web2, say like Facebook, this is a problem for them. Everything, all the value they derive is based on owning your data and creating value. So they will resist it. But actually, I think for governments, for instance, if they fully understand it, it's an absolute net positive. Because what governments are trying to do is they're trying to restrict those big tech companies. They know they have this problem where tech companies have too much influence and too much power. But they're not treating data as a property right. They're treating data as a privacy, as something you need to control. But actually, if you do that, you're not allowing a user to monetize his data or his time in the same way that we monetize our time in the physical world. Like if you go to work, your time is monetized because you're doing something for your time and someone pays you for that. That's actually what is happening every day online, except we don't recognize it, right? That kind of digital serfdom that we exist in. So talk about transitioning. Once users begin to understand it, in the same way that 500-600 years people started to understand, you know what, a democratic framework might be better for me, right? A sort of owning property rights and actually capitalism is better for me. There's a complete shift that is irreversible. People who go into Web3 deeply, very few, if any, come out and say, blockchain, that was rubbish. what a scam. Let's go. When you talk to anyone who actually goes down the rabbit hole of blockchain and what it means, they all sit there and completely fall into this rabbit hole and never come out because it's so much better than the alternative. So there's no comparison. From our perspective, this will completely take over the world.
Fantastic. Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your time today. I actually have two unrelated questions. So the first is, blockchain community or the space as a whole, and including you, it's safe to assume is very bullish on NFTs in terms of GameFi and gaming and metaverse in general, right? But apart from that, what is the areas that you see NFTs being adopted in real world scenarios apart from gaming? Or
Okay.
like metaverse?
Yeah. So first, we think that let's talk about digitally native products, and then we can talk about sort of physical derivatives, right? So digitally native products, NFTs are the objects and things of the metaverse. And that's an important component as they represent physical objects in the physical world. But you need an economic system, right? So DeFi became the banking platform and that economic infrastructure, which is what cryptocurrency represented. And of course, DAOs, which we haven't talked about, but decentralized autonomous organizations are essentially the governance structures. So they become the companies and the countries, if you will, in terms of that structure. Put together, you have the potential to build metaverses, which are basically communities and societies that you lock together. So digitally native ones, I think everything will be running on NFTs in the same way that they don't have to be valuable like artwork. They can be land that you own. They can be, they can be sort of even just, literally sort of utensils that only have base utility. So NFTs don't have to be expensive, but they have a use case. And I think it's important to also understand that the use cases are human in nature in the same way that we add sentimentality on objects that we own. Like a wedding ring, for instance, is something that is not very valuable to most people in the world, but to you and your family has a very particular value just to you. Right? So that's what's not possible in the digital space. When we talk about physical sort of derivatives, you should also expect that NFTs will tie into that for contract reasons. One of the reasons why blockchain is so powerful is that liquidity is entered into these markets. So whether you fractionalize ownership of something, whether you represent ownerships for trade, like it's a deed, right? An NFT ultimately represents a contract, a deed. And if I could actually trade my contracts that I have in the physical world in the same way that I could trade sort of on the stock market, that would create more liquidity and financialize that segment as well. So it adds more value and liquidity, but it moves into the area of being a security. Right? And so we don't think that the physical and the digital world sort of become separated. They are still very intertwined. So there is a natural crossover, and it's only natural that NFTs have the potential to represent physical and digital items. Like I'm expecting that when you sign a contract to buy a house, it will no longer be a physical contract. It will be literally the transitioning of an NFT that is sort of transacted, and that becomes the deed because you can online immediately say you own that house or you don't own that house, but the central register is no longer required.
Last question. Let's take one more and then we have another speaker. Yeah, you please.
There tends to be currently a lot of noise, right, surrounding the NFT industry in general. But given that there's true value in the technology itself, where do you see next steps going where we actually mitigate that noise and the broader public realizes the true value of NFTs being sense of ownership?
So anytime any place, be it country, economy, business, emerges and grows and there's a lot of money involved, you will have noise. Right? .com bust, right? Mobile space, China, like China when that grew incredibly was, had a lot of noise as well. A lot of people even said, China, those growth numbers are impossible. That must be a scam, right? And there were some things around China that was fraudulent, but thankfully most of it wasn't, right? It's the same thing right now. There's a lack of understanding. It's a paradigm shift in thinking. So for a lot of people, it's going to be difficult to translate what that means because they look at it from their own lens and say, this is my life and this is what I know. How can I translate that? Most people have not been trained, and this is really, I guess the classic schooling systems that we grew up in have not been trained to think exponentially at all. Right? And actually what technology is really at base level with Moore's law. That's really the base case. Exponential thinking and exponential growth in all areas. Once technology once computing particularly touches anything, the growth cycles become exponential. Blockchain is just, sort of another version of that. And because most of us don't have the ability to think exponentially, we doubt things that have exponential growth until they're already there. And this is also true not just for, like technology, but also in the physical context, like people doubted China, or people doubted other areas where there was economic growth. Now, in terms of where we'll mature, the industry will self-regulate, regulation will come in, governments will go in and create rules and so on to make sure people are protected. Banking systems will come through in one form or the other. This is what will happen. We've seen this cycle repeat time and time again. But the outcome ultimately is net much more positive. Like imagine, for instance, that we all own our data, right? And if someone wants to use our data, they ought to pay us for it. Now, this is what's powerful here, is that we can now choose to give it to a Facebook or a future version of Facebook or someone else, entirely based on how much they give to us. That is a far better framework than what we have today. So again, once people come to realize that, they don't necessarily have to understand, what does property rights really mean and how that defends democracy. Most people don't even understand how democracy works, otherwise we'd all be voting. Right? But they do understand what's good for them. And in this case, once you understand the benefit of the capital value, they will understand that it's good for them. Like the artists who are making NFT art, for instance, or the musicians that are doing NFTs, or even the gamers who are basically earning from play to earn. They don't go back.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Class, how was it? We're investing and seeing a lot of new innovation. What are the one or two things that you're seeing? Say, class, take a look at the one or the other thing that maybe sparks an idea for the class in terms of building into their product. Is there anything that has wowed you over the last month?
Well, so first of all, I would encourage everyone to go and attend some of the NFT demo days that are out there.
Okay.
So Brink, Launchpad Luna has a demo day coming on the 16th, which is next week. It's open to the public, right?
Luna.
So we'll
Okay.
share some links maybe.
Okay, fantastic.
It's good because, first of all, I wouldn't say so much, particularly in a portfolio, which is our favorite, because it's like asking which is a child, right? That doesn't work. Also, we're equally excited for all of them, of course. But is to see what some new startups are building and the ideas that they have.
Okay.
Listening to their pitches will help you basically get some broad ideas. But I would say the one thing we always look for universally is the builders who are thinking in very equitable mind frames. Right? Now, the classic form of capitalism and building a business has been about extraction. How much value I can take out from the system, right? Which is how Web 2 works, which is how classic capitalism works, and that is a business model that has functioned in the past. But when you're building anything on blockchain, even with the layer 1 and layer 2s, it's all about community building. If you have no community, you don't have a blockchain, because blockchain as a basis is community built. And really, it's like building a nation, a small city, or a small society. When you extract too much out of society, you lose it. Imagine a country where the tax rate is 90%. You're not going to get much economic growth. Right? Imagine an environment where the top people take all the value out. People will leave. So the kind of person who is successful in building something within blockchain has to be, in our view, someone who has a very equitable mindset, who thinks much about justice, who has lots of thoughts around it. These are not easy topics, right? There's no such thing as it's super fair or whatever, but it is something that consumes them. If they're able to think this way and have empathy for the people around them, we think those are the best builders in this space.
Fantastic. Another round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hey, everybody.
Ian, can you hear us?
Yep. Can you hear me?
Can you hear us? Fantastic. Can you hear us? How are you, Ian?
Doing well. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Can you hear us?
Yes, I
Yep.
can.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Ian.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Let me do this. And we switch from one great speaker to another great speaker. Ian, thank you so much again for dedicating your time and sharing lessons learned. We have Ian, who is co-founder of Syndicate, a Web3 startup that has raised over 22 million from A16Z. Collect. Tech 1, 2, test. Yes, you guys can hear me. A16Z. Kleiner Perkins, IDEO, and 300 investor. Previously, Ian was managing partner of IDEO, Collab Venture, a crypto venture fund backed by IDEO, focused on Web3, crypto, and blockchain startups. Well, Ian, are you seeing the button to share your screen? Because then I'll go here and go off stage, at least from a visual perspective. Maybe you want to test it real quick.
Yeah,
And
just give me
hand
1
over
second.
the screen to you. Fantastic.
Yep. Just give me 1 second. I
Please
think
take
it
it
should
from here. Big round of applause for Ian. Thank you so much.
All righty. Give me 1 second while I do this. All right. This is my first time using this software. So let's see here. Okie dokie. I cannot see anyone. So I'm going to assume that people are actually in the audience. How about that?
Give me, give me one second. We're pointing the camera to the audience. Guys, make some noise so he believes at least that there is some.
Awesome. We're having the video.
And this is not a recorded audio file, so it's live.
All right, cool. So how much time do I have to present? I'll just pace myself as such.
25 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes.
Okay, and that leaves enough room for Q&A, or is that including Q&A?
Yes, 25 minutes leaves room for 10 minutes Q&A.
Okay, cool. So everyone,
can you see the class now?
Yeah, I can see it. Looks like a nice auditorium there. Cool.
Fantastic.
So hey everyone, really great to be a part of this. Really excited about what you're doing here. Yat, actually, hey there. I don't know if you remember me, but Charles Hayes and I are connected, and I think you and I have talked a number of times. So it's awesome to see that presentation. So as was mentioning earlier, I've been in crypto full time for 8 years now. I was the former head of crypto at Citigroup globally, starting in 2014 for 3 years. Helped start IDEO's division in crypto 7 years ago, and then have been an investor, a VC. Basically, I spun out a VC firm out of IDEO, invested in tons of startups in Web3 over the years, and then started my own company called Syndicate, which we may talk about a little later, focused on DAOs. So what I wanted to do was share a little bit about, what I've learned, both at IDEO and investing and helping startups, and now building my own startup in relation to prototyping and validation, which I think is the topic of today's session. Okay, so the number one failure mode for any startup, Web3 or otherwise, and actually one of the other failure modes of Web3 startups is to think that they are not like other startups, like they are. Hate to break it to you, is that the startup wastes time and money building something that no one actually wants. And this has been plaguing startups forever. It's especially been plaguing crypto and Web3 startups from the very beginning, because people have, I think, had this view that it's this amazing technology, and if you build it, people will just come. And maybe that was true years ago when there wasn't really much in the world in terms of crypto and Web3, but that's not true anymore. And people need to realize that. And so if you are going to build a startup in this space, you need to build something that people actually care about. Now that sounds kind of obvious, but the question is, how do you know that what you build, that what you're building is actually something that people want? That's actually a really hard question. And answering that question is what determines whether your startup fails or it ends up becoming really big. Okay, so IDEO developed this methodology in the 80s that it calls desirability, feasibility, viability, which is a framework for thinking about how to come up with new product ideas, new businesses, new startups, etc., which is just to mean that something must be desirable, it must be feasible, and it must be viable in order for it to work. And it needs all three of these things. Now, IDEO has this very opinionated view, which I strongly believe in, is that you actually want to start with desirability and figure out whether or not it's viable and feasible. And when we talk about prototyping and validation in this context, what's really important for an early stage startup or a project or Web3 company or whatever is to first figure out, prototype, and validate the desirability of something before building it and trying to commercially sell it. And what I'm going to show you are some of the best practices and methodologies for how to prototype and validate or invalidate something's desirability. Okay, so some people call this UX research. Some people call this design research. Why is it important? Well, maybe so people don't poke their eyes out. But the truth is that it's much more powerful than that. And so, this is what put IDEO on the map in 1980, was inventing the first commercial consumer mouse for the Apple computer. And, before this product, which we now all take for granted at this point, and is just commonplace, was released, this was a new piece of technology and interface into computers that people hadn't experienced before. So to understand whether or not people would actually want this thing, it actually took a lot of research and work in order to figure out what even was this interface, what should it have been, how should it be designed, etc. And this is what IDEO was also famous for in 1981, was inventing the first laptop. And it's kind of ridiculous looking at it now with this this phone attached to it. But the point is that the same methodology that can be used for creating breakthrough products can also be used for creating breakthrough businesses, both in Web 2, Web 3, or otherwise. Okay, so what are the advantages of design research, as we call it at IDEO, or effectively this prototyping and validation methodology? So number one, you save time, you save money, and you save a lot of effort. More importantly, or just as why is that? It's because you actually know what to build before you build it. So, I have seen this a lot, having invested in hundreds of startups in Web3. People often do the reverse. They build it first without knowing if they should actually build that thing or if people want it. And what they do is they spend millions of dollars and months, if not years of time, only to find later on that actually that wasn't what they should have done. And so what will save you a tremendous amount of time and effort and money is validating, again, what is it you should actually build? And once you have high validation on that, then go build it and put all your money and effort and talent and team into that. The other, strategic implication is that obviously it leads to fewer pivots. You're actually, the interesting thing is you're actually constantly pivoting by constantly prototyping and validating. It's just that you're not spending tons of design and engineering time doing that. And so as a result, you actually have fewer errors, and fewer errors lead to fewer pivots. Fewer pivots, lead to longer burn and runway, and therefore higher chances that your startup will survive and succeed. And the other thing that prototyping and validation does that a lot of people undervalue is that if you do it right, along the way while you're prototyping and validating, you're actually starting to build a community of fans, of followers, of users, of customers, of partners that want to help you succeed because they are providing inputs into the development of your product and of your business. And so these moments, these interactions that you have in terms of prototyping and validating with users and customers are actually opportunities to build your community if you do it correctly. And as Yat was saying earlier, community is everything in Web3. And so people can treat it this way beyond just trying to extract information out of people, but actually use it as an opportunity to build meaningful relationships with users and partners. Okay, so I think one of the articles that I shared earlier was what Google Ventures published around these things called design sprints. And the guy who did it, Jake Knapp, who actually is at IDEO now, was actually based on IDEO's methodology that it had developed, decades ago, where you develop these cycles where you go from experimentation to create prototype to test and back again, and you keep looping over and over and over again. And through each step in the cycle, in different ways, you're learning, right, in different ways. In particular, though, what you're trying to get to is a prototype that you actually put into the hands of an archetype user or customer and testing that prototype and then learning about your hypothesis based on how that prototype performs with those end users. And what you saw in that article was that design sprints actually short circuit this cycle. So when you look at like Lean Startup, for example, that book by Eric Ries, which I absolutely love, that methodology, which was developed like 10, 15 years ago, by people like Steve Blank and whatnot, it was very methodical in that it went through these cycles, all the way, like over and over and over again, right? And the Lean Startup talks about how you can make those cycles like maybe 2-week cycles, right? And actually, like Jake Knapp's and the Google Sprint methodology suggests that you can short circuit the cycle so that it can go 1 week long. Now, what I would argue is that there are ways to short circuit it even faster, where you can iterate and short circuit this cycle in a matter of days, actually, or even a single day. And the companies and the startups that are able to short circuit and iterate through this cycle faster and faster and faster to the point where you can actually create prototype test, create prototype test, like within literally like the same day with, multiple users, you're going to learn faster, and therefore you're going to be able to build faster. And that's what, I've been teaching startups in the Web3 space as an investor. And now that's what we're doing at Syndicate and have been for over a year since we started the company. So what does that mean? Like, how can you actually short circuit the cycle and bring it down to hours, not weeks? Well, let me give you an example. So when we were developing infrastructure to power DAOs, and this, we started this company in the beginning of 2021, which was a long time ago. I mean, DAOs back then weren't even really that popular. We didn't, to be honest, know exactly what to build. We had certain, critical hypotheses, but we didn't know exactly kind of like what the form factor of it would be, how the infrastructure and protocol would be designed, even what the requirements in terms of the application would be. So what did we do? We literally faked it with end users for about 6 months. And what we did was we just manually hacked shit together to see how they used it and what they did and how things broke so that we could quickly iterate before actually building the protocol and the infrastructure and the application. So Komorebi, which was this DAO to invest in women and non-binary founders, which we helped activate in like February or March of 2021, we literally hacked this together in a matter of days. And we created this this web page on the left-hand side, which was on Syndicate's application web. I mean, it was on Syndicate's website, but this was literally coded by a front-end engineer with no back-end. It was just like a simple page that suggested that there was a DAO behind it, but when in fact it was just a multi-sig behind it. And that's what we did literally for the first 6 months, was we were just prototyping by throwing different DAOs out into the world and seeing if they worked or not. And people didn't, excuse me, people didn't know that. People thought that, I mean, honestly, that we had built a protocol, that our application was completely finished, when in actuality, we were just like hacking stuff together that was already available in the Ethereum ecosystem. Now, along the way, while we were kind of like shipping these things and learning, we were also doing deep user research. So what I was describing earlier in terms of like strong UX research, we set up these methods, right? Like things, this is literally like a screenshot of what we were doing to try to understand our users and what it was they want, and tested certain hypotheses about what they actually cared about, right? And so if you look up on the right hand, the top right hand side, what can Syndicate do for me? These were some of the user research methods that we used to try to develop real signal and invalidate and validate certain things about what were the core value propositions that Syndicate needed to build its infrastructure around. And you can see here in the top right that there were 5 different things that we were looking at. Like, do they care about sort of legal entities? Do they care about community kind of management? Do they care about protocol integrations, et cetera? And all of those directions, you know, were equally interesting. But the question was like, what was the 1 or 2 things that we actually needed to construct the whole protocol and application product around? And that was actually a very nebulous question. Like, any one of those 5 things would have taken our engineering and protocol team 3 to 6 months to build. So, you know, instead of trying to build all of them at once or guessing, we wanted to make sure that we knew which one out of the 5 or which 2 out of the 5 we were going to put, you know, millions of dollars of engineering effort into. So taking a step back, we did this across, you know, dozens and dozens of users. And so that screenshot that I showed you, that was for one customer or user interview. You can see here, we did it across like 50. And what we did was, and I led all of these, we jam-packed our schedule and cycled through these interviews within a matter of 3 weeks. So those 3 weeks were like a living hell for me, but we just like literally back to back to back to back to back to back, 5 days a week, like, you know, from 7 a.m. to like 6 p.m. We just went through every single possible customer that we could talk to. Now, what's interesting is that after about 6 of these, you start to see some patterns, actually. And what you do is you start iterating after that like initial cohort of like 6 or so. So you actually start modifying things on the fly. You start like going deeper in certain areas where you're starting to see some signal or validation. You start backing off of like certain hypotheses that you're now starting to see are becoming invalidated. And you just go deeper and deeper and deeper to the point where you start actually starting to like go further and prototyping or wireframing even the product itself with customers on the fly. And so within a matter of like 2 to 3 weeks, we had very, very high conviction and high validation in terms of what was the exact product that we were going to spend all of our engineering effort over the following 3 to 6 months to then go build. And that's what we did. So around the summer of last year, after we completed that research, we were looking at actually multiple different product directions. We were looking at venture capital funds, applications for DAOs. We were looking at these things called SPVs for DAOs. We were looking at other types of DAO types and whatnot. And that research revealed that investment clubs were actually one of the highest demand products and implementations and applications of DAO infrastructure. And we learned that kind of in like July, August of 2021. And what we decided at the end of that design sprint, that prototyping and validation sprint, was we were going to focus all of the company's resources, engineering, design, legal, BD, et cetera, on shipping and building the best investment club product in the market. And so we focused on that for 3 months. We just went heads down. And, we worked on that, and then we shipped that in January of this year, 2022. And, what ended up happening, even though a lot of the industry was like very focused on a lot of other things like governance systems and whatnot, was that within a matter of weeks after shipping our first product, we became the largest DAO creation platform in all of Web3. And at this point, we've now created 700 DAOs in Web3, which makes us the biggest DAO creation platform in Ethereum and all of Web3. Best estimates are that we're well over 10% of all DAOs in Web3 at this point. And, that obviously that traction has started to help us gain a lot of momentum with partnerships, investors, other customer groups and things like that. So I just have a couple more slides and I'm sure there's a bunch of questions. So there are very rigorous methodologies for how to do design research, which is how to prototype and how to validate, potential new solutions before you actually build them. So some of those methodologies include these 4 here. So in context is where you actually go visit the user that you're trying to build something for. So, in Web3, this is a little bit weird. Like if you're building like a DeFi startup or something, you would actually try and go identify your archetype user and literally go follow them around. Not like in a creepy way, but like in an anthropological, like ethnographic research way. So a good example of this was, if you're familiar with a startup called Acorns, right? That fintech called Acorns, where, when you buy something, it takes the change and then it puts it in like a savings account. That idea was actually invented by IDEO. It was developed by IDEO when they were doing a project for Bank of America. And the story is that a bunch of IDEO researchers, they went into people's homes. And what they did was they were observing people when they came home, what they did. And one of the things that they found was that when people would come home from work or come home from dinner, they would put their keys on the table when they come in, and they would take their wallet and put it on the table, and they would take change out of their pocket and they'd put it in a jar. And then they noticed that, and they noticed it a lot of times, obviously. I mean, some people probably do that here if you actually use, money these days. But the point is, they saw that, and the researchers asked them, why do you do that? What do you do with that change that you're putting in that jar? And they said, oh, I'm saving. I'm going to put it in the bank and I'm going to save for my kid's college account. And that insight led to the roundup feature that was actually implemented first in Bank of America and then turned into a whole fintech startup called Acorns. And the only way that you can do that is literally by going into the context of the user that you're building for and observing them and being curious and being inquisitive. So in context research is actually a really powerful tool to identify product opportunities and validate product opportunities that maybe are unexpected. Empathy is where you walk in the user's shoes. So like IDEO used to do this a lot where like you take like one of your proto users and you like go live a day in the life of them. Like you literally like kind of try to pretend like you were that person and like imagine what their needs are. So it's kind of related, but like like for example, you would send like researchers or whatever, like product developers, to a shopping mall or like a store, and you would tell them to like go do stuff, right? And like you would make them experience and empathize with the end user so that you could better imagine what their needs were. Analogs, pretty simple. I mean, a lot of people do this in the technology space where you like look at one thing that is actually totally outside of something else to try to like see if there are comparables. So the classic kind of like example that is often used is like IDEO was designing like an emergency room sort of design and setup. And what they did was they actually researched an analog with F1 racing and what the pit crew and the pit stop was kind of designed like, because it's like a high performance environment where you like can't mess up. And they studied like F1 pit crews to help design like what a better like surgery table and stuff like that would look like. So like that's another way. Like so Web3. I mean you can do that pretty easily with fintech, but there may be like things outside of finance or whatever where you could like draw inspiration. And the last one that I really love is extremes. So a lot of like founders and startups or whatever, they try and build for the biggest market because that's the logical thing to do. When in actuality, when designing like a new technology or a breakthrough product, it's actually often best to design for outliers and design for these extremes like this long fingernail, meaning like you want to go to a user or a customer where the pain is actually the greatest and it's the most extreme environment, not like a general user. So a good example is that in 2019 and 2020, like every crypto startup was like a DeFi startup, and every DeFi startup was trying to build for what they called the crypto curious user, which was like the person that maybe has some crypto in Coinbase, but doesn't have anything else. And there were a lot of them. And most of those startups didn't actually end up working. What they should have been doing was building for the most esoteric, like power user of DeFi and building around those needs. So Chris Dixon at Andreessen Horowitz talks about toy markets where like, some of the best companies, they look like toys and they look like these stupid things that you're doing on the side or on the weekends where it's really small, but it ends up being a big thing. I think that like designing for extremes is actually very similar, where you build this thing that kind of looks dumb. It's like for some really esoteric user with extreme needs. And then over time, you start to, as you build traction there, you actually start to abstract things and then making that solution more broadly applicable to broader masses of users. Okay, so I think this is maybe my last slide. There's a lot that you should be, looking more into in terms of how to do like really, really strong design research to prototype and validate things. But here are some of the big lessons. Number one, know who your user archetypes are and what the hypotheses that you want to test are before you go into your user interview. A lot of people, novices, they go in without actually knowing who they're talking to. Like what their the archetype of the consumer or customer is. And so they don't know what to test for because different users are different archetypes, and different archetypes have different needs, biases, etc. Like they're just different people. And as a result, like something that may look like a signal may actually not be a signal because you didn't understand the user archetype when you were going in. So it pays off to be really thoughtful about understanding the different user archetypes that you want to focus on, what their drivers are, what their needs are, what their pain points are, what their biases are, like going in. And as a result, shaping the different hypotheses that you're going to test and designing the research, the validation, and the prototyping to really sharply test for those hypotheses and nothing else. Because if you don't, test for hypotheses, then what the hell are you wasting your time doing user research around? The second thing is always bring a prototype. So some people like doing or think user research is like getting on the phone with someone and like asking them stuff. That is not user research, and you're not going to get good signal, and you're not going to get validation out of that. Always bring something to show the user and something that they can actually like interact with, whether like touch or say like, hey, what if I click that? Like this makes me think of this. Always bring something, no matter how crappy it is. Number 3, watch what they do, they say. So a lot of people, when they're trying to like validate a business or a startup idea, they talk to people and they go like, hey, do you like this idea? Like, do you think that's cool? People are nice. They always go, yeah, that's a cool idea. Yeah, that's a cool idea. That doesn't mean that it's actually a cool idea. You have to, that's why it's important to bring a prototype so you can actually see what they do. And sometimes like how they interact with it, if it's an actual like clickable prototype, like a website or a mobile app or something like that, obviously you can get like pretty good signal from that. But there are even more subtle ways. Like for example, one of the pro tips is you actually look at the person's face over video or in person when you're showing them something. And if they are like scrunching their head, if they're going like this, like that, that means they don't understand something. And you can actually pick up on these really subtle cues from people. This is more of like an art than it is a science, without necessarily building like a mobile app. And those signals are real if you do enough of these. The fourth thing that's really important is to try to actually simulate the purchase decision. So what I find a lot of people not doing well is they like kind of like show a website or they show a mock-up of an application and they go like, what do you think? Is that cool? And people go like, oh, that's cool. Yeah, that's like a great idea. Like, okay, thanks. Like, great. I'll see you later. And then they try and go and tell investors that like this idea is validated. That's not validation. If you're going to spend millions and millions of dollars building something, you want to know for sure that this is actually something that customers are going to use or buy or pay for. So how do you do that? You simulate the purchase decision in these interviews. How do you do that? There's a bunch of ways that you can do that. As an example, you can say, hey, do you want to like be one of the pilot customers of this? And by purchase, I don't mean necessarily money. I also mean like time and resource. Like time and resource is money. So you can actually interestingly like approximate purchase decisions by asking them to commit more time to you. So you can say like, hey, we're going to build this product. And by the way, do you want to commit like a month's worth of your time and maybe an engineer's time to get this product into your hands and out in the market? And if they say no, that's a signal. If they say, hell yeah, like I'll give you my engineer. And like, by the way, like let's schedule a meeting on Monday morning and it's like Friday afternoon. That is a signal of a purchase decision. And so the closer that you can get to approximating the purchase decision in these interviews, the higher signal and higher confidence that you're going to have. And the last thing, which is a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's really true, is if you're not sure if someone likes it or doesn't like it, if they're not jumping out of their skin, then they don't want it. So, very crass. If it's not a F yes, then it's an F no. And this is a pro tip that I've used in literally every single design research study that I do, which is I'm trying to get them to jump out of their skin for what I'm pitching them. And if I cannot do that, then that to me is signal that what I am doing or what I'm proposing to build is actually not that desirable. Or I haven't picked the right user to try and sell that to. And that has saved me millions and millions of dollars and lots of time and effort. So I hope this helps. I hope this makes for a better company or project or whatever it is you're building. And if you want to follow me and connect with me, please do so. Thank you.
Big round of applause for you. Again, thank you so much for customizing your deck. The class is exactly the customer discovery case. Let's take 1 or 2, 3 questions maximum. Yes?
You want me to speak in the mic?
Yeah, just because if he's online, he wouldn't hear it here, yeah.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for this presentation. I just wanted to ask you about the Syndicate Clubs, the last project you launched. Since, well, it's I love it, and I encourage everyone to read about Balaji's mural table article that goes along with it. And I just wanted to know about your vision of the product and a bit maybe the roadmap you have, if you want to share, of the next iteration of the product, if you can.
Yep. Yeah, sure. Happy to.
Thank you.
So I'm very opinionated about this, but I think that pretty much everything in Web3 actually ladders up to DAOs. People just don't realize that yet. So I think that DeFi, I think NFTs, I think most other projects in Web3, they will ladder up to DAOs. And so the question is, what are the opportunities in DAOs? And there are many in terms of its applications. So one of the questions is what is DAO technology? A lot of people view it very myopically, in my opinion, very narrowly as decentralized autonomous organizations. I would argue that DAOs don't have to be decentralized, they don't have to be autonomous, and they don't even have to be organizations. So what the hell is it then, right? In the same way that NFTs were actually understood when they first came out in 2017, and then in 2020 and 2021, and now recently, like it's having this resurgence because people are now like thinking about it in a different way. I think that DAOs are very similar. And what I would posit is that DAOs are a technology, a Web3 technology that coordinates financial capital and human capital natively together on the internet. So what does that mean? It is a financial social technology. And what social financial technologies can do is reinvent a lot of things, including the future of work, creator economies, all these other things, but in particular, investing. And so we are building DAO technologies to reimagine the investing industry. We've started with investment clubs, but that's just one product. So we have 5 other DAO products that are currently in development that go after different applications of investing in different markets. Some are more institutional, some are more retail, some are actually for philanthropy and charity applications. And so we'll be rolling those out over the course of this year.
Thank you. Next question. Any more questions? I know we're a couple of minutes over. Well, in this case, again, thank you so much again. Thank you for the time. Appreciate class. I hope it was valuable. I want to thank again Ian and Jan for investing the time and sharing their knowledge here with us. And please stay tuned on our Slack channels for the next assignment. And see you next Thursday. Thank you so much. We'll meet you in the metaverse. Bye.